Well, at this point, why don't we turn things over to the audience, to you folks, and broaden the conversation. I think Whitney's going to ask people to come up to the microphone, and we'll take your questions in turn.
Educational moment.
Yeah. I wrote down a question, and then Megan partly answered it, and that was about any sort of transcripts of what happened at the adult lyceums, the lectures. You talked about the anecdotes and things that might not quite have made it into the writing, but I wonder if they all did, or how it worked, both for Thoreau, for Emerson, and for Fuller, and for anybody else.
Luckily, Elizabeth Peabody's transcript of the first series of conversations, or we think it was Elizabeth Peabody's because it was then copied in somebody else's hand. I mean, it's like the dial, it just proliferated even though it was never published. But her notes on this series of conversations, they are available. It's been edited and in print. You can find that. And the record of the school, but what I was also thinking of, and Margaret Fuller's conversations there was one co-ed series, and they were, notes on those were taken by Caroline Dahl, and that was published many years ago in a book called Margaret and Her Friends, so you can read those conversations, which are really not at all like what went on just among the women, so it's lucky these other things were found. But I think also that there are some of the journals of the Brook Farmers, journals of...
There's correspondence by people who went to some of the lectures.
Yes.
There are actually reviews of lectures. I mean, it was a form of entertainment, so in some of the newspapers you actually can find reviews of what went on there.
Yeah, there are multiple transcriptions of a lot of the public lectures around the region and the country that Emerson and Thoreau gave too, and many other actors as well.
But I was thinking of the children, the students' journals. Do you know there's, I think it was Rick Delano had an article about those. A student, I think at Houghton Library, there's some student journals, either from Alcott School or young.
Yes. Well, there's some of that preserved in Conversations with Children in the Gospels as well.
There's that, but these were particular little children.
Well, the go-to place for Brook Farm in the first instance would be Sterling Delano's book on Brook Farm.
Yeah, I have that. Yeah, and the other thing is, I've been reading Theodore Parker's sermons, another transcendentalist, another long-winded orator, who is very popular, and his sermons are actually very information-based. And he was a person who didn't believe in miracles, and that got him in trouble sometimes. But I was just curious. I mean, he drew huge crowds in Boston, thousands of people on a Sunday, and his lectures went out. He's not famous anymore because he didn't write a book, I think. But
he did write a book, but they're not so readable.
Right, that's right. Well, neither are the sermons now either, but they are informative if you want to learn about the time. And I'm just wondering about how, I mean, there are a lot of strains of transcendentalism, and we talk about that here. Brook Farm, I think of as a much more communitarian group of people, but Emerson trying to get people into Concord and using his environment as a reason not to go to Brook Farm when he turned it down.
I think this sort of speaks to the value of biography for these people. You can't, maybe there aren't, particularly people who haven't written or published extensively. Dean Grodson's biography of Theodore Parker is wonderful, and you can find out a lot of great biographies
I've been
of all these people.
teaching Unitarian history of
Let
that
me say
period.
a word or two about Parker,
Good.
who's certainly been on my radar screen. There's a theological radicalism side to the Transcendentalists. I mean, think the God within. There's a strong claim there. And Parker carried that torch importantly. He also was important in that he refused to leave the ministry, even though his confreres wanted to kick him out, many of them. So he was a firebrand in that sense as well. He was one of the leading abolitionists, and the anti-slavery edge of the Transcendentalist movement is one of the most important of its social trajectories. And that's where a number of Parker's densely documented sermons come from, too. So all of these, in all of these ways, Parker was important. He was a crowd-drawing, eloquent speaker. This is example par excellence of the golden age of American oratory. None more forceful and compelling amongst the Transcendentalist group than he in doing that. So hence the very big crowds that came to hear him. So he shouldn't be lost to history, although he hasn't, in the last century, had the front and center attention, for the most part, that most of the other people that we're talking about have had. When the Unitarian Universalists celebrated their first century in the 19-teens, Parker was the charismatic figure who was remembered back as a formative hero. When the second century rolled around, Margaret Fuller displaced him. Not without reason, but the wheel turns.
Is the current charter school movement or any other changes that are happening in education right now leading us toward an educational system that Thoreau would approve of?
Wow.
Wow. I mean, Thoreau wouldn't approve of any educational system. I mean, he would think we should all be autodidacts and learn what we want when we want to learn it. I think the charter schools would be better than the public schools in Thoreau's eyes, but I don't think he would approve of any systematic learning such as that.
I'm thinking in comparison maybe to the school that you and
I mean, right. I mean, he'd certainly be closer to what he had run. So. We're always in trouble.
But we're also always okay.
We're always okay.
Although Thoreau is also really grateful for having learned Latin and Greek and had the classical education he had at Harvard.
Right. So although he mocks his education at Harvard many times, he's also grateful for it because he did. He learned the classic text, and that's so central to his writings.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that? You know, is there one system of education or format for education that any of our thinkers that we're discussing would promote as a nationwide strategy? Or would they say that it takes different methods?
I don't think for Thoreau there could be a nationwide strategy. I just don't think he would want the government to take a huge nation of people that are so diverse and put one stamp of education upon them. So I would say, in his eyes, no, there could not be that kind of solution.
In Walden, he famously says, don't follow me because if you do, by that time I may have found out a different way for myself. So I lead you at your peril. I think that the time in which all of our protagonists flourished was not a time, with the exception of Horace Mann, perhaps, when the educational initiatives that they favored and tried to pilot at different degrees they thought of in pan-national terms. I think they thought rather in terms of bringing a light to humanity rather than in terms of national grids, national structures. Again, I'd make an exception for Mann, who's operating within a state system.
No, he
and
definitely
Megan
felt
might know.
his plan should go national, and the New York schools followed Horace Mann's school, and it did go national in a certain way. But I also think we have to realize that, you know, the Brook Farmers thought Brook Farm would go national too. This was a model of how we ought to live, or they didn't necessarily think, but they hoped this would demonstrate what everyone could do in their own way, though. Not, they
I
weren't
just
gonna-
tend to resist the term national here, though, as if the nation state was the limit of the ambition or the what the level of geography that they mainly thought about.
Well, maybe that's where kindergarten, does it all. It really was international, and there was a lot of, Elizabeth Peabody's songs for the nursery were translated into Japanese and sung there, and some attempt to have different instruments. And anyway, it's maybe that was the success of this.
There,
I'd like to hear just a little more about the origins of the progressive educators' belief in the innate goodness of children. You mentioned the litmus test of God within, but did this come out of a reaction to Puritanism, or what was that about?
Yeah, well,
People hear my question?
yeah.
so where did the God within idea come from?
Or was that the basis of the innate goodness of children?
There's a dotted line that can connect the Reformation Puritan hyper-concentration on the saga of the individual soul coming to conversion and bonding to God, all the way down to the transcendentalist moment, at least those with some kind of spiritual proclivity to them, like Emerson, who started his career as a minister, like Thoreau. Only you have to strip away all the Calvinist apparatus of doctrine and reduce it to the drama of the soul's aloneness with God. But that's not the only line of causality. Another one, just to give one example and stop there, is international romanticism. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. We come trailing clouds of glory from God who is our home. This is Wordsworth. That's in the air, and parts of Rousseau as well. So there's something about the moment. You can connect it to the side of Republican vision, the democratic experiment that at least potentially honors each and every individual, although, as we very well know, it turns out de facto to be for whites only in framers' assumptions about the case. But human rights has that in potentia, at any rate. So there are a lot of different antecedents here, a lot of different causal strains that come together. It's one of the fascinations of trying to do intellectual history vis-a-vis transcendentalism. So I'm sort of playing out my own inner drama in answering your question about the inner drama.
Well, it's interesting that self-reliance or Fuller's idea of fullness of being is coming into, these phrases are coming into being at the same time as the human rights phrase, which is really was taken up by the Grimke sisters and William Lloyd Garrison as the abolitionist cry. So there's human rights, there's fullness of being. Maybe they had different vectors in their direction of reform, but it's part of what you've described so well.
And there's also, with that sense of the divinity within, that we are all divine, we're all children of God, you are able to strip the minister of his power. And so you no longer needed the church, you no longer needed a minister to be your conduit to reach God. You could now have a very personal relationship with God. It's why somebody like Thoreau was probably more spiritual and more respectful of God than most of his neighbors who are going to church every Sunday.
Well, and I think this is why Caroline Dahl, a young transcendentalist, much later in her life, in trying to trace the history of transcendentalism, says it began with Anne Hutchinson and ended with Margaret Fuller. Anne Hutchinson, who was defying the church authority and
The first
gathering women.
New England heretic who basically appealed to the higher authority of the God within.
A couple of things I'd like to ask you. Thank you for interesting what your comments have been. It seems to me that the transcendentalists, if we can describe them this way, that they're, if we call them pedagogies or their philosophies of man, aren't really applicable to the problems of education that we have today. And the reason it seems to me is, first of all, they were living in, Concord was, what was the population of Concord in, 3,000, 1,500?
At most, 2,000
Yes.
more.
So we're talking about Boston, I don't know, Boston was, what was it, 30,000, 40,000? So the populations, it's a completely different time of life. And now, we have crisis of education. I don't know when the first crisis of education in American history started, but it seems to me that as much as I revere, and that's my particular individual life, just to be interested in these things, it seems to me that most of what they said isn't really applicable to mass education after a certain scale. Because first of all, what they said is for individuals, and when you've got to educate a mass of people, it's a different goal. So just a couple of questions. What were their general intentions, the purposes of education from their different views? It seems to me that, we're now speaking about this. This is what is the title? It's the Modern Lyceum, and we're sort of reading them now as feeding into our questions of education. But in those times, they weren't thinking about solving our problems now, obviously. So the question I have is, one is, to what degree was education important for them as individuals? Was it just like a side thing, like it was like a part of their interest? And did they feel like there was a crisis of education? So these are just some of my sort of scattered comments.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Don't forget what you were going to say.
I probably will.
Yeah,
I already did.
Don't. I was just going to say, I think we're forgetting how much education today really was affected by these progressive movements. I mean, we don't have 60 or 100 kids in a class. We don't have rote learning particularly. We have circles, people, let's have circle time, let's discuss things, water tables, sand, conversation. We read a book, we talk about the book. In high school, we talk about the book. So I think there has been more influence than we're giving credit for. There definitely was a sense that there was a crisis then, and there have been repeated crises. There was a crisis about how to educate the people of this new republic, and that was what Horace Mann was fighting for, and that was what Elizabeth Peabody and Thoreau were also trying to establish a way to do this, because it was very important. It was extremely important after the Civil War, as waves of immigration came, and this was a big part of the kindergarten. Actually, it was a kind of pre-settlement house movement, and the kindergartners were actually the teachers, and they were the kindergarten was very important to establish in immigrant communities. And that's why we had the Elizabeth Peabody House in what was the West End, and the Fuller House, which is in East Cambridge, named for these early educators. But the question of, now please, I hope you've remembered what you're going to say, because I've said
I was just going to, you've already covered it, but that there was a crisis in Thoreau and Emerson's day also, and Emerson referred to people learning but not being educated, and what we're creating is a country of know-nothings, that people are going to school but coming out still not any wiser and not really learning. And the purpose of education in those days, as we've learned now, is that you don't stop learning when you come out of high school or whatever school you come out of, that is continuous for the rest of your life. And that was really important to people like Thoreau and Emerson, that you continue to learn, you continue to explore. That was really essential for a well-rounded human being.
I have three things to say, all different. Firstly, that a self-respecting transcendentalist should greatly value your interrogation as transcendental. Emerson says in one essay, I look in my friend for a manly resistance and not a mush of concession. Second, this is meta-historical. We look at the past in the 21st century through wishful presentist eyes. So as time unfolds, the past seems to change, and there's a kind of hallucination to our presentism that makes anything we say by way of interpretation about the past and use value suspect at any given point. On the other hand, the past potentially can be a corrective to our presentism. So it's not wrong to search back over the very different dispensations of social change to look for potential instruction in what might seem so remote and obsolete. Here I'll just say one thing, this is my final, about the use value of that moment. If the defining feature, by contrast, of education today is massification, scaling up, and of the complexification of social organization today versus then. Well, maybe all the more should we take to heart the Emersonism, souls are not saved in bundles. That's something to bear with you when you feel that we're being defined at this moment by massification, by the mass scale, as opposed to the small scale. I could go on, but that's enough. You've heard enough from me. Thank you for that pungent series of observations.
I was just going to say, I'm a student of Brook Farm, and specifically I play Sophia Ripley in The Women of Brook Farm, which we've performed a couple of times. And so I've looked into her writing, because she was the head of the education program at Brook Farm, and she also had a school in Cambridge, which was where Fay House at Radcliffe is now, and James Russell Lowell was one of her students there. But she wrote in the Dial, before the Brook Farm experiment started, they did study communal living seriously and cooperative living. They called it associationism then. And she and George, her husband, headed off to Ohio to look at frontier communities. And one of the things they found in the Zoar community in Ohio was they liked the idea of everybody working for the whole so that people had more free time, but they found that people did not spend their free time learning things. So she immediately swore that if she was going to have a community, education would be central to it, which is a very transcendentalist / New England kind of thing. And she was, in fact, the third woman present at a lot of Transcendentalist Club meetings with Elizabeth Peabody and Margaret Fuller, so she was into that movement. And the other thing is that German philosophy was very much a base of Transcendentalism, and I don't know early 19th century German philosophy, but I'm wondering how much of the education, or whether any of the education came out of that before kindergarten, the idea of the Transcendentalists toward education.
Well, Pestalozzi, is that how you pronounce it?
Pestalozzi, Italian.
Italian was
Progressive
the leading light, really, and I should know more about him than I do. But isn't his name one of those around the Boston Public Libraries? You know, he was on the exterior, people to admire and learn from, and he was a progressive educator, and his ideas were discussed in the 1820s, I think, and also very influential with Alcott and Peabody both. I don't know, I mean, certainly they were big readers, or Peabody taught herself German, so she could read the German philosophers, but I don't know that there was education on the marine. But she was the translator of Di Girondo's Self-Education. This is French again, but that was a very influential text for Emerson, and the notion of continual education of the self, and also another book of Di Girondo's, The Visitor to the Poor, which helped inspire a number of ministers to the poor in the Boston area. So,
and George Bancroft studied in Germany and brought a lot of those methods back to this country.
Oh, so in the college, I see, at the college level,
the Round Hill School in
Hampton, all right,
started,
okay, good.
And including things that you don't hit the children and various things like that, and you do have that kind of experiential learning, all of which he brought back from Germany.
Along with the whole idea of the Prussian educational system, this kind of national system of common schools. So you have those two.
Yes, Mann was drawn to that.
The bureaucratic and the very individual from the same region, and very much in tension, but not always in tension as well.
Yeah.
I'd favor shying away from Germany just in relation to the heart of your question, because it seems to me that it was through misconstruction of what German idealism amounted to that the Transcendentalists derived such aid and comfort as they did about the God within from that quarter. And I don't want to go into further technicalities. I'd rather go over to the first part of what you said, having to do with utopian communities. You mentioned Zoar in Ohio. I think it's useful to remember that this was a moment in history, really the moment in U.S. history most prolific of such experiments. Brook Farm and Fruitlands were two of dozens, secular and religiocentric, of many stripes and points of origin, mostly but not exclusively throughout the northern states. Historians have tended to focus on single place studies, or in the case of Transcendentalism, maybe Brook Farm and Fruitlands coordinately. But I think the Ripley story that you've told goes to show a big deficit in what has been accomplished so far, and a need to try to better understand this tapestry of experiments in relation to each other and what it all signifies. It certainly signifies a country in as nascent a state of cultural formation as its geography was, with the territory of the country expanding by leaps and bounds throughout the whole period that we're discussing.
Oh. Thought he would ask a question from the hostess.
I was just curious, since we do have 4 educators here, I thought I would take the opportunity to ask, this question, or 2 questions, sort of calls for more philosophical than historical knowledge, but I was wondering how you guys feel about if it is important to teach to the inner God in students, and if so, or if not, how does one teach to the inner God? Do you guys teach to the inner God in your students, or?
What do we think of the big idea?
Well, he always has such great questions, and I'm glad to have Michael from my class ask a question. There are a lot of ways one could answer that question. For me, I feel that much of my most profound learning experiences were as a music student in a kind of one-on-one experience playing the piano, and I feel that there's something about that I always try to accomplish if I can in the class, so that I'm somehow addressing each person, even as in some way in the class. I don't know if that's, I guess for me it wouldn't be the God within, but I think there's a transcendentalist notion of genius, that we all have a spark. Well, I guess the transcendentalists might call that God as well, but for me it's this spark of genius or talent or capability that I hope will be nurtured, lit, fan the flame in the class, and I do find it challenging to teach a large class. Even my large class of 15, I'm always trying to seek the individual in some way.
That speaks really very well for my own life saga too. In my comparative salad days as a younger teacher, in conversation with a seasoned near retiree who didn't think much of the transcendentalists, and partly because he didn't think much of the student groups that he'd been working with in recent years. You know, they're never the same as they were 20 years ago. He asked me bluntly, "Do you really believe in this God within business? Every kid has a spark of the divine?" And I said, "Yes." Now, you could take divine metaphorically, but the point is the unlimited potential that is there to be tapped. Now, let me say in addition to that as life has unscrolled, I feel that when young, I tended to think of that value in more privatistic, solo terms than now I do. I think it's important to be able to translate it into a sense of community, and not just a sense of me first or me become God. That can be a root of temptation, leading to all sorts of pathology and malformation.
And since I don't actually teach in the classroom, I don't do formal education, it's hard for me to say what I would do if I had a group of students in front of me, but I do actually take the divinity within to heart, as the transcendentalists talked about it. I do believe we have that spirit within us. What Megan referred to as the genius is the guiding spirit that leads us on. Whether we follow that spirit or not is up to each individual, but I think there is that something that is innate with us that if we trust in it and follow it, can lead us in wonderful directions.
Maybe you should answer, John,
Sure,
also.
I'll jump in. I'll say, of course, we try. And anyone who's a teacher.
Speak into the mic.
I'm sorry. Of course we try. I was getting too passionate. And anytime you teach somebody and you have that spark of connection with a student, that's why you do it, and that's the God within. That's that sense of here's another soul that is going to teach me, we can teach each other, we can learn. It is hard in the systems that accrue around education. It's hard in the day-to-day grind of assignments and readings and grades and structures and meetings, but you can't lose it. The other thing you can always do, though, is give your student a book. Give them a book by Thoreau, by Emerson. Have them read transcripts of the conversations that take place. That individual soul with a book that's given by a teacher is really the heart of it. And that's really the gift that we have with these writers, is that they still speak. And in some ways, that distance they speak from makes that message become that much more powerful and that much more clear. And in some ways, our job as educators is to get out of the way and to let that spark develop.
Your trek to the Maine woods, was that, it wasn't a solo trek, is that?
No, it was very much a communal endeavor.
Yeah.
In the spirit that Larry mentioned. It was an effort to draw attention to the Maine woods. And it's interesting, in some ways it was an economic gambit. It was trying to raise the profile of tourism in the Maine woods. And so we had all kinds of media with us trying to get the hashtags up and running and the tourist displays.
Any students along? Or?
There were no students, although we were all students. But it was more than that as well. And I think what struck us all is that when you get people of good faith together, the motives may be mixed and complicated, but there's still some kind of spark and core at the heart of it. And for us, it was a number of people who loved Thoreau deeply, who loved the area deeply, a number of Penobscots who had a very real sense of stewardship. And that became a very powerful educational experience where in some ways just letting it happen and letting the landscape work its magic on us made it work. That is very hard to replicate in a classroom in a semester of 15 weeks. But those moments still happen. And I teach teachers all the time. We wrestle with the Common Core and MCAS and the rest, and there are still ways you can work around those to what matters most, and any teacher worth her salt will find those every day.
So this is just a question as a college student. As I've noticed throughout the years, education has become more and more of a business, especially with standardized tests, with the SATs, even with the ACTs, ACTs, or whatever they're called. A lot of them are created by the same business, the same company, College Board. Even within the colleges themselves, they're run by a board, such as Harvard, at Northeastern. For instance, the president of Northeastern has a ridiculously large salary, which many students are protesting. And sort of education is becoming more and more of a business. And I see a lot of students and teachers fighting back against this, but I was wondering what you think we should do to prevent education from becoming a business. And so it's something that actually does truly affect us, while at the same time doesn't make us all broke.
I want to hear what John has to say about this.
Oh, sure. No, and we wrestle with this all the time at a state university. Are we there as an economic driver for students who are trying to, really in a social justice mission, trying to raise their earning potential over the course of time? And we fight back all the time. We're there for the liberal arts. We're there for teaching students to be critical thinkers, to be engaged citizens, to dig in, and it's something you need to fight all the time. And if you're teachers who really do connect and care with your students, you're not going to lose that spark, even as you understand that there's money involved here. You need to keep it in perspective.
I'm really lucky to teach at a college that's kind of an arts school, really, and its mission is so unusual, and its history is also unusual. It began as Emerson College as a kind of a school of elocution, and most of the students, I think, were women. And this evolved into performing arts and theater and film and writing. And so I guess the question for us really at Emerson is how to make this education, which is it's a private college, accessible to as many people as possible, to as many capable people who qualify for this education. And that's the question. It has to be a business to some extent. We have to raise funds so that there can be scholarships, and teacher salaries can be paid, and then of course you get into all kinds of arguments about what else, you know, the administration, this and that, funding for what. But I think it's you know, I don't envy college presidents their role, which has now become, you know, so much fundraising involved in that. You can't escape it. But I guess, speaking personally, I'm glad that there's a mission in this college that I feel is worth raising funds for.
It would be naive to hope that any educational institution could operate at a 0-degree business consciousness level. Not going to work. That said, there are huge differences between an Emerson College and a for-profit diploma mill, to take the worst case example. And along the continuum in between, it's all too easy for the notions of training and education to become crunched together and seem indistinguishable. We're not just talking about a problem that's internal to the way that schooling institutions function. It also has to do with the public climate. It has to do with parenting. It has to do with those macro dimensions of what sends a person through any kind of educational passage. I do think that it does matter a lot what sort of climate along this spectrum an individual teacher operates in. I've lived my life in 2 incarnations, one at Oberlin College, a progressive liberal arts college, the other at Harvard, an R1 university. And there are lots of differences of the sort that we're talking about between those 2. It's easier to maintain a kind of eye on the educational intrinsics at a liberal arts college like my former avatar. Harder at a place like Harvard, despite the genius quotient and most of the actors in their core knowing that education and training are not the same thing. But all an individual teacher can do, just in the role of individual teacher, is to try to keep an eye on the way that Emerson characterized education of the person at its core, the drawing out of the soul.
Perhaps I just end on a somewhat Thoreauvian note. So, I mean, John was talking about earning potential as, you know, and I guess the big question, the Thoreauvian question would be, what does our earning potential need to be? What do we need to earn to make ourselves happy? What do we need to make ourselves happy? How much money do we need? And so to go to college, to get the degree, to increase your earning potential is a wonderful goal, if your goal is to earn more money. But if we're using Thoreau as our core, the question would be, what is all that money for, and what are you gathering, and what are you accumulating, and what does it really do to your inner worth and your inner wealth? Does it make you a better human being? Does it make you a better citizen, a better family person? Does it make you a better part of your community? What does it do for you? And so I guess the question, Paige, would be, you know, why are you in college? What are you going for? What are you trying to do and accomplish when you're there? And is it going to really do it for you? Not that you have to answer that, but I'm just saying that those are the questions we really should be asking ourselves, is why are we going through that whole process? the end goal is to obviously earn more money and to get a better career, a better job, but is that necessarily the job you want or the career you want?
It's probably very appropriate to end on a question. I'll turn things over to Whitney to wrap it up.
Did you see what Jeff just did? He said he doesn't teach, but I see him all the time with students of all ages. And every few weeks, we hear from someone who says, "Oh, I decided to spend more time doing this because Jeff encouraged me to chase my true genius," or change their major, maybe. We have someone in the audience who did that as a result of, so yeah, talk to Jeff if you're soul searching and need to find your true genius. And but anyway, thank you so much on behalf of the Walden Woods Project. Thank you all for being here, and I want to offer a heartfelt thanks to Professor Marshall and Dr. Buell and Dr. Cusick for so generously sharing their time and their immense insight. I think this conversation could cover so many areas, and it could be a whole weekend long. Maybe we'll do that at some point. Thank you so much to Old South Meeting House for their partnership on this event, and hopefully more in the future. We'd love to be back. Our next Lyceum event will be held at Smith College in the fall on racial and other forms of social injustice. Please visit walden.org for more information about that and all of our program offerings. If you are so inclined, please also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the Walden Woods Project. And if you had a question that you didn't want to ask up at the mic or that you think of on your way home, feel free to tweet it to our Twitter page, or you can email education@walden.org, and we'll do our best to respond. We are selling some books written and authored by our panelists who have offered to sign if you would like that. Please also visit the table if you have questions about the Walden Woods Project, what we do, if you want to get involved. Thank you again. Thank you so much, panelists, moderator. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.